Hey everyone, welcome to the Coach Catalyst podcast. This show is about helping you grow as a coach by standing on the shoulders of giants. Each show, you get a different mentor in your ear. The early motivations, the successes, the failures, the tools, the tricks, and the insight into where the industry is going. All of it so you can make your own dent in the world. Remember, success leaves clues. Now, without further ado, on to the show.
Welcome to the Coach Catalyst podcast. I'm your host, Trevor Whitwer. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Now, if you're an online coach or thinking about being an online coach, this is the episode you want to listen to. Dr. Mike has a very interesting story where he got his master's and PhD really in something unrelated to exercise science and fitness and coaching, but transitioned his career and has definitely made a career out of it. He gives some great advice to online coaches on how to get started and ways to really set some expectations and how you work with your clients. So definitely check out this episode if you want to get into the online space. Mike is a super smart dude, and we get into a lot of that as well. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Dr. Mike T. Nelson, welcome to the Coach Catalyst podcast.
Hi, thank you so much, Trevor. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, but you're in a lot sunnierville than I am, so you're probably doing maybe a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm down here in South Padre, Texas. As I say this, the last couple of days have been northerly and windy and rainy and cold. Well, cold, relatively speaking. It was last week, it was in the 80s, which was amazing. And then yesterday it was 53 degrees. And myself and a bunch of other kooks decided to go kiteboarding in the rain and 53 degrees, which we did.
Do you wear do you do a wetsuit or...
I do now. The first time I started coming down here years ago, I was like, oh, it's South Padre. It's always nice in fall. And then I remember one day it got stupid cold. It was like 47 degrees. It was like gusting like 20 to 30 miles an hour easy. And I'm like, well, I should probably still go kiteboard anyway. And so idiot me went out and I had purchased a wetsuit the year before, but just a super thin one. Okay. I didn't have gloves or anything else. And literally within 20 minutes, my hands were just like, I couldn't do anything afterwards. And so there's a guy there who I think they're from Alaska. He's like, yeah, man, you just put surgical gloves on and you'll be fine. I'm like, surgical gloves? What are you talking about? He's like, because it protects you from the wind. And I'm like, okay, sure, whatever. My hands were frozen, go in my car, warm them up. So I put these surgical gloves on and go back out. And it helped, except for the water would go on the inside of the glove. So when you would crash, you'd have to fly the kite for a while, and I'd put my hands up like this, like trying to shake all the water out of them, and it wasn't the best idea. I went out and bought some actual neoprene gloves if it's that cold.
What is the water temp there?
It varies. It's weird because yesterday the water temp wasn't too bad. I mean, I would guess maybe 75.
Okay.
So when a northerly comes in, like the first day, what I've noticed is the water temp will be around the same. The water's relatively warm. So like when it's sunny, like we don't wear any neoprene or anything like that. On the bay side, there's a bay and an ocean side. But after about a first day, because of the direction of the wind, all the water gets kind of changed out. And so then the water starts to get really cold. And it's not stupid cold. It's probably like the coldest the water I think has ever been here maybe is like 55 or something like that. I'm guessing on those temperatures. But it feels cold. Like if you've ever been in 55, 60 degree water, it's not super warm.
Right. What's the highest jump so far?
Getting close. My goal is to hit a 20-foot jump, which is measured from the ground to the top. And I hit 17.2 the other day. And that was on my small kite, on my little 9-meter kite. It was pretty windy. And when I did the jump, I didn't actually take off real well. So normally you have to cut pretty hard with the board and just bring the kite vertically above you and it'll pull you up. Yeah. And I kind of screwed up the takeoff a little bit. And I hit there's a little thermal because it was warm that day towards the land. And so I just kept going up and then kept going up. And I was like, oh, crap, like leave the bar in. And I actually landed it. So I was pretty happy with that.
What's the hang time on a jump that high?
That one was 4.5 seconds.
Okay.
So you're kind of floating through I have a little device that measures all of it because I'm a weird nerd like that.
Right.
So it was 4.5 seconds, 120 feet I landed from where I took off.
Okay.
So my max distance so far is 136 feet. Max hang time is just a little bit over 6 seconds.
Wow. Oh, that's wild. Yeah. That's awesome.
Which is weird, right? So if you ever do any jumps, even snowboarding, kiteboarding, whatever, like if you're in the air for like a couple seconds, it feels like all time has stopped, and it feels like it's like forever.
Yeah. I was out on the mountains. I'm a big snowboarder, and we were going off some like jumps, like little baby jumps, and we were videoing a few, and I did one, and I was like, man, I was probably in the air for at least 5 seconds, and we watched it on video, and I maybe got like 3 feet off the ground, and it just like popped up, but it feels like you're going forever. But no, I mean, it's awesome. Like, I mean, so you're talking to us from South Padre Island, and you have a business, and you're still running your business, and you're able to do it in kind of a cool remote way. And we're going to dig into maybe how you got there. But let's go back to the beginning, because health and fitness and performance wasn't always the track, right? So take us back to kind of how you made that transition from where you were going to go and deciding that, hey, I'm going to do this performance thing.
Yeah. So the semi-short version is I did a undergrad and Bachelor of Arts Natural Science, decided to go to engineering school. So I did 2 years post-grad, then decided to do a master's. So I did another 2.5 years doing a master's in mechanical engineering, biomechanics. Although my research was in heat transfer, so I created a thermal model of a big microwave transmitter zapping a bunch of monkey heads, just sponsored by Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. And at the time, it was so classified, they didn't tell me it was classified. They were like, yeah, it's for collision avoidance systems on cars. And I'm like, okay, whatever. You're going to pay for my research so I can get the hell out of here? Cool.
Right.
And then 5 years later, my advisor sends me this little thing from a local paper that says, military declassifies ray gun. And he's like, yeah, this was your research. It was so classified, we couldn't tell you it was classified. I was like, oh, okay. So I finished 8 years of school doing all that stuff, and then started working for a medical device company. So I worked in pacemakers and defibrillators for what was Guidant and then Boston Scientific. And at the time I thought, well, I'll just, do this. And it was fun. Like all the people I worked with were great. But I realized like I was spending all my free time just going to exercise physiology conferences and just annoying the crap out of trainers in the back row. And I couldn't understand why no one reads research. I'm like, what? You guys are trainers. Like, you don't read research? They're like, no, we come to conferences like this. I was like, oh. And I decided to go back to school for a PhD in biomedical. I finished all the classwork for that. And then just ended up switching to exercise physiology. And around that point, 2006, did my CSCS. Started training people in person for a while, which I think was a really good experience. But I fast realized that, man, if I had to do this for like 40 clients a week, I would probably jump off a bridge somewhere, because it was one of those things where I could do it. And like, if you're watching the sessions, you probably couldn't tell a huge difference, but it was just so draining, because I loved all the problem solving aspect. I didn't like the day-to-day of counting reps and, what they're interested in and that kind of stuff, which if you're in-person training, that's a huge portion of it. And, some people I know are really good at that and they love that part, which is great. I realized I don't care so much for that part.
So, I mean, were you in sports growing up, or kind of where did the interest in exercise physiology and performance come from? Because I mean, you're very on like a different engineering is kind of, I mean, they're kind of similar, but also very different.
It basically came from because I was horrible at sports. Like I thought as a kid growing up, like it's normal for some kids like myself just to get hit in the face with balls in any ball sport. And that some kids just didn't get the genetic lottery and they just suck. And that's just, that's the cards you were dealt in life. And that's the way it is. So like in like even middle school, even through the first part of high school, like there was always an argument. I was always the last person picked for any team. And then the argument was, well, do we really have to have them? Can we just play one person short? And that usually went on for a while. And then they're like, no, we can't leave someone not play your sport. Right. And later on, I realized I had some eye issues. or actually don't see in 3D. So you have two eyeballs, right? They go to the back of your brain in the visual center. And your brain says, okay, because they're skewed a little bit because of the position on your face, you have these two images, and your brain then fuses them together and creates a 3D image. Mm-hmm. In my case, it doesn't do that. My eyes were offset so much that as a kid, I started seeing in double vision. So the brain's solution to not seeing in double vision, because it can't fuse the images because your eyes are too far apart, is to then do what's called visual suppression, where it just drops one of the images. It goes, aha, instead of seeing in double vision, we're just going to drop to a monocular vision, and that's the way we're going to solve the problem. Which is okay, it's better than seeing in double vision, but like the stuff that's easiest for people to do, like playing softball, if I was in the outfield and there's a pop fly, I just sat there the whole time and almost pissed myself because I didn't want the ball to come towards me. Because looking straight up without any other visual references was like the hardest thing for my brain to figure out where the ball was. But for most people, that's very easy, right? You've got plenty of time. You can kind of see the ball moving. You know where it's at. But I didn't figure any of that stuff out until later. But at the same time, started college. I was, 6'3", 156 pounds. So I was like a eel-shaped rake. And that was after my first year. I was going into my first year of college. This is like after all your growth spurts and all that kind of stuff. So I'm like, maybe I should figure out some weight training stuff. And physiology is always interesting. So I thought, well, I can figure out how to, better myself along the way. And just kept taking, took exercise, a 4,000 level exercise physiology class just for fun, basically. Because I was like, oh, this is like fascinating. And you can apply it to yourself at the same time.
Right. So you were on the engineering track, but you always kind of had this itch for physiology, and maybe because you're just like personally, you're like, hey, I realize how I can impact how I live on a day-to-day basis. And so, was the interest more just you kind of taking it in and being like, hey, I want to do something better for myself?
It was kind of both. I took an undergrad anatomy and physiology class at St. Scholastica, which was one of the rare universities for an undergrad that you had a cadaver lab. So they got new cadavers that were embalmed every quarter. And I just walked in. There was no prereqs. You could just sign up for the class. And so it's one of my free electives. I did anatomy and physiology 1, 2, and 3. Now the professor was awesome. And I was like, oh, this is super cool. But I always looked at it from a weird sort of engineering standpoint. And I thought about going and just doing anatomy and physiology, but at the time, it's like, I don't know what the hell I'd do with that. Like maybe teach. I couldn't see any real world application for it per se. So that's why I kind of went into the engineering route, because I was going to do more like biomechanical, biomedical, because I liked engineering. I used to tear stuff apart as a kid and never get it back together. So everyone's like, oh, you like doing that stuff, then you must like engineering. And that seemed more like a path I could see going somewhere at that point.
So was there a moment then when you had kind of finished your engineering stuff, finished your program there, where it's like, you know what, like I need to do something different, or I'm not going to be happy in 10 years, 15 years?
Yeah, it was kind of a couple things. So I realized that, the company I worked for, the stuff was it was pretty interesting. So I liked that aspect, but I also realized the longer I was there, because at the time I started kiteboarding and just doing some windsurfing stuff, and I'm like, oh, it's windy, can I get today off? They're like, no, you can't request days off on the night before notice. I'm like, oh, you can't? Shit. And I'm like, I have vacation. I realized that if you work for someone, you're always trading time and money. Like you may be able to work more hours, you may get a promotion, but generally get more responsibility, and then you're investing more time. And I never really felt like I got any of that back at the end. And then I also realized that I was just spending all my free time reading exercise physiology, going to conferences, and it was sort of related to what I was doing, but yet wasn't related. And so then I started, following. I remember reading all the early stuff on T-Mag. I would print them off when they came out on, like Fridays, because they used to release everything on Friday. And I would take my lunch period because there wasn't a gym where I worked, and I'd read all the articles from, like John Berardi and Dr. Lonnie Lowry and a lot of the early stuff there. And then I saw John was going back to get his PhD. I had met Lonnie. He finished his PhD, did an RD. And I was like, oh, oh, wow, there's people in the industry who are sort of doing their own thing with advanced degrees, but are not necessarily in the gym every day training people. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I'm like, I wonder if I could do something along those lines.
As a coach that runs challenges, I needed my life back. I had stuff all over the place. A Facebook group for community interaction, Google Sheets for check-ins and measurements, and was drowning in email communication. As my challenges grew past just a handful of people, I started to notice clients were falling through the cracks. I began researching virtual assistants because I just couldn't manage it all. And truthfully, the client experience was going down the drain. Luckily, a friend recommended coachcatalyst and just told me to trust her. I'm sure glad I did. Now I can run my challenges with 2 or 200 clients with just a few clicks. The lessons get delivered on the right days, the accountability happens automatically, and most importantly, the communication is all in one spot. I even created 2 new challenges from the coachcatalyst library. Best part, didn't have to change a thing. I used to spend 15 minutes just trying to log into all the apps I needed. Now I log in and my dashboard tells me who needs a shout out and who needs a kick in the butt in about 15 seconds. I feel like a huge weight is lifted off of my shoulders. I can finally spend my time coaching again instead of worrying about all the admin work. Do your brain a favor and get coachcatalyst.
So was that one of the reasons you went back to get a PhD? Because I mean, to really get started in the industry, like you don't necessarily need an advanced degree.
No, and at the time I started doing my PhD in biomedical engineering. And my rationale was I was going to go back and do a second master's in physiology. That was my plan. And then I met a guy, Tim Lasky, who worked for Medtronic, who worked for a competitor. Super nice dude. It so happened that I shadowed him when I was at Michigan Tech. He graduated from Michigan Tech, where I did my engineering stuff. And he was working doing physiology work for Medtronic, another device manufacturer in the Twin Cities. And he's like, what are you doing? Like, don't go back and get another master's. Like, just do a PhD, because it's only another couple of extra years and you would have an advanced degree and not just another master's. Like for industry, nobody cares if you have 2 masters, but if you have a terminal degree, it looks better. And so I was like, oh, that's cool. I can take a lot more, physiology stuff. But then I remember being in a class on MRIs. We had to take an electrical engineering elective. For whatever reason, I took a class in MRIs, and the professor's like, okay, we're now going to derive all the equations that are used in MRIs. And I'm like, oh, crap. And so he starts writing all these equations on the board. And I look around, like I'm the only, basically non-physics and electrical engineer in the entire class. Everyone's just like frantically writing stuff down. And I poked the guy next to me and said, hey, man, do you even know what's going on in here? And this is the guy who's doing his PhD in physics. He's like, no. And he's frantically scribbling stuff down. And it was at that point, I'm like, oh, man, I spent like 5 years doing this. I wasn't able to get funding. I hadn't started research. It's the whole sunk cost fallacy thing where you've invested so much time, like just to drop all of it and change direction. Just at that point, just didn't seem like it was worth it. And I'm like, once I get done, I would have an advanced degree. I can do whatever I want. But at that point, I'm like, okay, I either somehow miraculously figure out how to pass this class, or I just drop out and go over to exercise physiology. So I dropped out at that point. That fall, went over to exercise physiology, which once you're in the system already as a PhD, you don't have to reapply to most other areas. And then, of course, I literally show up day one. I knew advisors like, hey, we've got 2 projects that both involve math. One's on heart rate variability and one's on metabolic flexibility. And I'm going, oh, no, you got to be kidding me. Like, I come over here because I don't want to do any more math. I don't want to do any more engineering stuff. And he looks at me and he goes, hey, you, math boy, whatever your name is, like, these are your projects now. I was like, oh, shit. But it turns out the math wasn't, compared to what I had done in the past, it wasn't really too bad. And it actually worked out quite well.
And that was how many years ago?
That was, I'm trying to remember. So it all seems like a blur when I started that, because I finished my PhD when I was 38, I think. So I started when I was 31, because it took about 7 years full time, which was just a freaking disaster, because I was still working for the med tech company. I dropped to working part time, was on call for them full time. And then about 3 years into my degree, I thought I was going to be done.
Right.
It's like, hey, this looks pretty good. You'll be done in about another year. So I go and hire a business coach, start doing more stuff online. So now I'm paying this business coach $2,500 a month, like trying to do that, and almost pissed myself to sleep trying to figure out how I'm going to figure out all this stuff. I got married around the same time. So there's a period of time where it was just a little bit more crazy than what I signed up for. But when you're in the middle of it, it's like you at some point you just kind of decide, this is what I want to do. I don't even know if it's going to pay off. God knows I'm like way overqualified to be a trainer, but it's just one of those things where I felt like if I didn't finish it, I would always just kind of regret it for literally just the sake of saying that I did it at that point.
Right. Well, I mean, you said some of the research was on heart rate variability, and that was before kind of HRV has become a little bit more mainstream, right? So you're kind of on the early cusp of that kind of trend.
Yeah, I started that, I want to say 13 years ago now, because there was not even any apps out on it. Like the only HRV system really out was a Megawave, and no one had really heard of them. Like a few people had, and so I was always interested in that. I was like, oh, this magical system that can tell you about your physiology. And I remember going to the ACSM conference on the West Coast, and I remember hitting up a guy out there. I don't know if I should say his name or not, but whatever. Hit him up and I said, hey man, can you just tell me more about this Omega Wave system? He's like, maybe. I said, like, what's your consulting fee? I'll find a way to pay you. He's like, take me out to a nice steak dinner place out of the place that I choose, and you can ask any questions. I was like, perfect. So we go out to this nice steak dinner, and he gave me some really good information. He was super helpful. But basically all the questions I was asking, he's like, well, it's kind of proprietary. We can't really tell you exactly how it works. So we finished dinner at like 10:30. We go back to his lab, and he like hooks me up to the Megawave system at like 10:30 at night. And I was staying, he was about 2.5 hours away from where I was staying. So we finished up there at 11, drive 2.5 hours back to where I was staying. But yeah, that was the only system out at the time that even used HRV. And so when I did the actual studies, they got human approval. We had bought probably 10 grand worth of used equipment, and you had to have a system to capture the HRV. They had to come into the lab. We had to set everything up. We had to capture all the data. I had to write a freaking custom MATLAB program to transfer it, enter it into this another program called Cubios. It was a pain in the ass. Where about 3 years after I started that, iFleet was one of the first companies that came out with another app where for literally at that point, I think it was like $12. You can put this app on and it will run it, through your phone. And I remember teaching at University of St. Thomas at that point after I was finishing up my PhD work, putting a picture of my phone up, trying to tell these students that like, hey, just like 4 years ago, we had all this used equipment. It was a pain in the ass. It was like 10 grand. Now we have this app. It's like $12. And I'm thinking like, oh, they're going to be like so impressed with the, modern technology. And all they said was like, oh, your phone, it's so old. Why is your phone so old? I was like, oh, I guess they're not impressed.
You know what? That's Tommy's for you. That's Tommy's. So
yeah.
I'm a Gustavus grad, so
I
can, there's a love-hate relationship there. So
definitely. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, the power of the iPhone, or really just a phone in general now, it's crazy. The amount of data, the amount of stuff that we can get. And even from a coaching perspective, like the information you can get about your clients immediately, they don't have to tell you, like it's all right there. It's crazy. So let's go back to, you hired a business coach early. So you're obviously like, hey, I want to build this thing. If you had to go back again, would you still make that same decision of hiring the business coach? Or did that force you to kind of, step up your game because you're paying this other person to do it?
Yeah. I remember like previous to that, one of the turning points I had was 2005, I think. I remember going to an event that Ryan Lee had put on. And it was awesome. Like it was the first, high kind of fitness marketing thing I had ever gone to. I didn't really know what to expect. The event was great. And I remember on the plane ride on the way home, like thinking, oh, these people are not necessarily smarter than what I am. Like, you have this impression that they must know all this stuff that I know nothing about. But I also realized I don't know anything about marketing. Like, I don't even know. I never took a marketing class. I didn't take anything. So I was like, oh. So fast forward, many years later when I hired a business coach, I remember the first call we did, and he's like, wait a minute. So let me get this straight. You are spending all your free time reading research and going to more conferences to acquire more fitness, nutrition information. I'm like, yes. And he's like, and you want to run an online business that's fitness related and you have zero training in marketing or business. I'm like, correct. And he's like, and what's the next conference you are going to? I said, oh, is this, ASN conference on whatever. He's like, you need more fitness information. Like, you need a bullet in the head. Like, you just need basic, marketing, communication type stuff. I was like, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. So I would have done it again. In hindsight, I would have not picked the time that I did because it was just way too stressful. But it was super useful, and he was good because the main things he went over was, how do you communicate? How do you write a sales page? Like, how do you, talk to people in normal language? And like the biggest lesson that it took me, probably $40,000 to get through my thick head was that you are not your audience. Right. Like the stuff that I wanted to do, most of the people that I was trying to appeal to could give two shits less. Right. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, of course I'm going to read, a brand new study came out on how mTOR1 complex affects, MPC, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, that's amazing. Like most people are like, I don't care. Like, what do you want? Oh, eat more protein. Oh, cool. Got it, bro. Right. So I realized you could probably do a market of just translating all the research into what people were interested in. Right. And that was kind of a breakthrough. And right around the same time, I paid for a consult call with Ryan Lee, who was super helpful. And I just so happened I had a blogger site at that point. I put up a thing on metabolic flexibility. It was a paper I had written. It was like super technical. And the only reason I really put it up at that point was to have a timestamp to show that, if this thing becomes popular, hey, I did some technical work here. It's timestamped. It's out in the internet. And it just so happened that I did a consulting call with Ryan that day. And so he goes to my blogger site and pulls it up and he goes, what the F is this thing? He's like, no one understands anything you're talking about. I'm like, I kind of put that up as more of a placeholder. He's like, no, you have to translate all this stuff. Like nobody cares about, this or that. And it was kind of same messages from two different places. That was very useful to hear.
So how did you get your first couple clients online?
So I started out, I did it inverse. So initially I was like, okay, I'm going to do online training. So I got a couple of clients, just word of mouth from friends. And it was a disaster. It was so horrible. This is, 2007, I think. Okay. It was right when, remember those flip camera phones came out where you could just start to get video and plug it into your computer? Yeah. It was right around that time period. And I remember thinking, oh, it's online. Like, I know enough about physiology. How hard is this? And I soon realized that I had no experience of how bad people could screw exercise up. Like, I assumed people know how to squat, right? So I program a squat. Of course they squat. I wasn't just general population. I wasn't training high-level powerlifters. And then once I started getting video and saw what they actually did for a squat, I was like, holy crap, I didn't know you could screw something up that bad. And so I ended up just shit canning the whole program because I knew at that point, knew enough to know that I didn't know what I thought I knew. Right. So I went back, did in-person training, worked at a gym for a while just to get experience of just the movement aspect to the point where if somebody said, okay, hey, I got this issue in my squat, I'd be like, oh, let's try this, this, and this. Right. Because I had done that in person and I knew what it transferred. And then I went back to doing online stuff in 2012, I think. And my little criteria was, okay, I'm not doing online coaching until I have enough reps to know how people can screw exercise up. I can get video. I have a full assessment that includes movement, nutrition, stress. Right around that time point, apps such as HRV, iThlete came online, so I could look at stress. I could look at self-report data. And so that's when I started doing it again because I felt like I could do a higher quality product that would still be useful to people. And then the price point would be a little bit lower. Luckily, I did start doing a blogger site. I did start doing a newsletter probably 13 years ago. So when I went back to doing online training, most of the clients I actually got were just from the blog site and from the newsletters at that point.
Cool. So, I mean, if you were advising a new coach, I mean, online is kind of all the rage, right? Because it checks all the boxes: time freedom, location freedom. Like, you still have to put in the work. Like, it's no different than working with people in person. But
yeah, totally.
Would you advise someone to, if they're a new coach, spend a couple years working in a gym, working with people in person, and maybe do the online stuff on the side, and then maybe transition to that after you have some more skills?
That would be my bias. I know a lot of people like, oh, no, you can just do online directly. And I'm like, I don't know. I'd be interested in your thoughts. My thought is no. Suck it up. Do an internship. Yes, you're going to get paid dick. Go somewhere, just get your own clients, like get practice counting reps, doing all the stuff you probably don't want to do. Because I think without that, man, it's just really hard to know what clients are going through and to see what they're doing. And when you're in person, you get immediate feedback if something worked or not, and you get to see a wide variety. So I tell people, like, train general population, train some higher level athletes.
Yep.
I actually think general population is harder than athletes.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, you get like a high level athlete, like do you get higher level of questions and problem solving, and do you probably need a deeper skill set? And some way I'd say yes, because you have to be much better at a systems approach. But from an exercise execution, like, they know how to squat, they probably know how to deadlift. Like, you give them a cue, they can fix stuff immediately.
Yep.
So from that aspect, I think it's a lot easier. In general population, you've got, Ethel, who's never done a weighted goblet squat in her life. It's just a lot harder. And I think you have to have a deeper skill set and appreciation to figure out what to do with those clients, what cues to give them, what if cues don't work. You have the whole internal, external, all that kind of stuff. So my bias is, I think, at least a year or two of just in-person experience. And then what I recommend coaches is to do a hybrid approach to start. Like, do all your nutrition, your lifestyle stuff, just move that online, and then have in-person clients, and they pay for both. Right. So you're like, okay, you're going to do 2 sessions a week with me, and then here's my program design and nutrition and lifestyle fee of whatever it is per month. Just do that, because you'll get the online experience then. It's easier because you probably want to talk about nutrition, recovery, et cetera, with clients. But if they're not paying you for it, they're really not ever going to do it anyway. And then you get the in-person experience with, coaching them through exercise and everything else.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're spot on. We always tell our coaches, if you can get a 12-year-old to hinge properly, you can coach anybody, right? Or if you can
totally
get a 75-year-old to hinge properly, like, you can coach anyone on the planet. And so, definitely general population and kind of adolescent kids. If you can improve their movement skills, like, you're golden.
Yeah.
I think that's a great strategy, because you just don't get the reps online unless you're just strictly in the lifestyle nutrition space, and maybe you're doing in-person meetings. But from a movement standpoint, like, you need to see stuff, you need to play with things, you need to see what works, what doesn't work. I think you're spot on right there. So as you started kind of continuing, you saw some traction with this online piece, and was there a point when you just kind of went all in and you're like, hey, this is what I'm going to do?
Yeah, I needed some type of transition. And the benefit I had about working in the med tech industry was I had a healthcare insurance, which is a big thing for trainers. Yep. And I had a house payment. I could make my house payment. And my thought was, okay, once I can get 60 to 70% of the income I make from doing my, quote unquote, real job, then I'll transition to online. I almost transitioned probably too early. And my financial advisor flat out kind of told me, you're an idiot, don't do that, which was probably wise advice. But it's also tricky, I think, when you work for a company, because it's very easy to stay there because the money is kind of quote unquote guaranteed. Like I knew exactly, at the time I was working 24 hours a week, I was on call full time, and I was making $52,000 a year, which is pretty good with insurance, healthcare, everything else. Yep. And then you have the conundrum of, I'm going back to school, I started this business, how do I ramp this up with like a very limited time? So my threshold was, okay, once I can hit maybe 60% of what I'm making here, I know that once I drop that business, I'll have an extra almost 30 hours a week I can put into the online space. And so I got kind of lucky that the business I was in, they were downsizing. They had gone through a few layoffs. And so I knew probably 8 years before I left that I was going to leave. And so I kept telling all my bosses, I'm like, hey, if you want to fire me and give me a severance package, like I'm your man, like I'm out. And like the first 2 years, I never got picked, unfortunately. And then towards the last year, I had just finished my PhD. I was still working for the company for another year. I knew they had some layoffs coming up. And I said, hey, if I'm not selected in this round, as of January 1st, like I'm done. I'm going to quit. And they're like, oh, but we can't pick people. We're not supposed to know this information. I was like, well, if I were in your position, I would want to know what's going to happen, because I don't want to be the dickhead that doesn't get selected. You have to let 2 people go from the department, and now I leave on top of it. So now you're 3 people down with the same amount of workload. Whether you want to know or not, whatever you do with that information, I don't have any control over. But I'm just telling you that come January 1st, like either way, I'm no longer here. Right. And in my head, I just kind of figured it's probably enough leverage where they're probably going to try to pick me anyway, because it's going to limit some of their loss. And it turns out they did. Unfortunately, the severance package at that point wasn't as good. I think I got like 2 months paid salary and 2 months health insurance, but better than nothing. Right. So just did that. And then, just transitioned to online at that point. And for me, it was a pretty easy transition because I had already kind of done it before. I think that the hard part trainers run into, which the reason I stayed there so long and basically did both businesses, was I didn't want to be put in a position where, holy crap, like I need money or I'm not making my house payment. Right. One, just because of the stress. And then 2, man, I don't know what kind of good decisions I'd make at that point. Like I may have been, the Herbalife salesperson or, made some choices I'd look back on later as like, ooh, that wasn't the best thing to do. Yeah. So I didn't want to put myself in that position because I didn't want the stress. And 2, I didn't want to have to try to sell everything under the sun just so I don't lose my house and that kind of stuff. Right.
So, so you were working at your job that was paying the bills. We were training people in person as well, kind of in like mornings and evenings before and after work type thing. And then you were also doing the online, or?
Yeah. Right? So for about a year, I did all of that. And then the in-person stuff was funny. Like the gym I was at, they transitioned once, they got new owners. I stayed there, but it was like, a thing where you rent from them, you have to get your own clients. And so I'm trying to fit them in and all these sort of weird, time points and stuff. And I remember going there one night to train myself. There's a little sign on the door that says, oh, hey, we filed for bankruptcy. If you want any of your money, please write to this address in Iowa. And I'm like, what? You got to be shitting me. Like, I was just here yesterday. Like, could you at least pull me aside and say, like, hey, man, like, we're closing. Like, you've got clients here and stuff. Like, here's a heads up. Right. So no heads up. So the handful of clients I had, I'm like, man, what do I do now? So I attempted to do the thing for a few months where I followed them around to their own gym and tried to pretend not to be their trainer and their friend, like coaching them on the side illegally. And I realized this isn't going to go well. I'm going to get busted. 2, it's just not worth my time to be driving all over creation. It's even worse than before. And so I thought, well, what do I do? I'm like, well, I've always kind of wanted stuff in my own garage. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll, take all the clients I have. I called them up and said, hey, here's the deal. Okay, come January 1st, I'll still be your trainer, but I'm going to order a bunch of equipment. I'm going to train out of my garage. The downside is I need money. So I will literally give you 85% off what you're paying if I can have the money by January 1st. And 2 clients were like, oh, that sounds good. I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Okay. So I did that, took some money I had saved, and, called up, Jim Wendler was working for Elite FDS at the time. So called him up, ordered a 2x2 rack, a bar, bench, picked up a bunch of used weights from people I know, trap bar, just enough stuff. I had accumulated some kettlebells. And then I actually just transitioned to people training out in my garage for about the next 2 to 3 years. And then those people kind of, dwindled down to just a handful of people here and there. But what I realized was my backup plan to all of it was, okay, if this whole thing just implodes, cool, I got a really nice gym in my garage, so that's fine. And 2, it's paid for, which is even better. Right. And what I realized was that people actually liked it better because I thought, I'm like, oh my God, who's going to want to go train at this weirdo's garage in the middle of nowhere? But I realized for a lot of general population clients, they liked it better because nobody knew they were there. Like nobody saw them. Like they didn't go to a gym. It wasn't intimidating at all. I'd already worked with them. And for me, just from scheduling, it was like the only way I could make anything work was the fact that I could just walk out into my garage and have people come to me in terms of scheduling certain times. One of the clients, I told them, I'm like, hey, I'll basically give you a huge discount. But I have to train at the same time you train because I literally have no other space in my schedule for you. And he's like, yeah, man, that's cool. I was like, oh, great. So that made it much easier. And then I kind of phased that out over time just due to, time, and just did online at that point.
Just random question. What did you do in the winter? Because you're in Minnesota, right? At this time? Like it's cold, like really cold.
Yep.
It's stupid cold.
Yep. Yeah, good question. Luckily, I live in a townhouse and all the walls are insulated on the garage except for just a little tiny bit of one of the other outside walls. Yeah. The door is insulated, so I redid the seal on the bottom. I played around with like space heaters for a little while and they didn't do squat. Like they would help the room temp a little bit. They kind of take a little bit of the chill off. But the worst part was the metal bars, and I hate having people use gloves. I put the bars like next to the heater, and like one part of the bar would be fine and the other part would just be just freezing cold.
Right.
So as much as my wife didn't like it, and she was very tolerant, I took all the bars and put them in our kitchen. So for many years I had the bars in the kitchen, and I would just take the bars out and train with them. Because especially like if you have I have a solid 2-inch axle bar that's 75 pounds, like it takes like a day and a half for that thing to get, something where you can hold on to it.
Right.
So I would just take the bars in and out of the garage from the kitchen, and it wasn't too bad. I mean, it was like 42 degrees in there was average. Okay. But there would be some days it would hit 21 degrees, 23 degrees. And I realized as long as the bars were warm, it didn't seem that bad. Right. But the second the bars were cold and you had to hold on to that cold metal for like, high rep stuff, that just made the whole thing miserable. And so I did that for quite a while up until 3 years ago, actually. So 3 years ago, I put in just an actual heater in the garage. I had an electrician come out, rewired it to 240. And so now we can leave all the equipment in the garage, which my wife likes much better. And we leave it at like, it sits around like 43, 44 degrees in the winter. Just enough where you'd hold onto the bar. It's cold, but it's manageable. Right. And that works pretty good.
Did you at least have like a vertical bar system or anything in the kitchen where you could like put them all, or were they just like strewn about?
So I had to limit the amount of bars I could bring in. So that was a little tricky. So in the winter, I didn't do a lot with the trap bar because that had to go in the little closet by the furnace, which was harder to get out. And then I literally put towels on the bottom of the floor and set them on one of the walls along the kitchen. So I would have like a straight bar, the axle bar, and then I would put towels on top of it. So it, to me, it didn't look as hideous, but yeah, that was a spot of contention for a while.
Your wife is a saint. She is.
Yes, that is
true. Oh, that's great. And so, I mean, at one point you were then kind of almost kind of forced to go online. And were you able to transition clients that were maybe training with you in the gym and they just, were able to move into an online format, and there was probably better technology at that point to support that whole process?
Yeah, I just kind of let them drop off and just didn't replace them. Right. And so the last two people I had in person was, one guy only came one session a week. And then one other guy was a guy I just trained with. And that's why I trained him at the same time. So I just let people kind of dwindle on their own, and then just started ramping up more of the online.
Were you transitioning to online, or was it just like they wanted in person, and then once they were done in person, you just kind of let them go about their way?
Yeah, it was doing both. So a couple of people, I gave them the option of online, and a few people I signed up with just a pure hybrid model and said, hey, you'll just come over once a month. We'll just do an assessment, make sure everything is good, and like the rest of your stuff is online. And then after a while, I realized trying to even just schedule that one session a month was getting to be too much, and I just did 100% online. Interesting enough, like one of the clients I worked with super early on, he was probably my 5th actual paying client, was an in-person client, like many years ago. Just left him on the newsletter list, kept writing into the newsletter all the time. And about 5 months ago, he hit me up. He's like, hey man, you haven't heard from me in like 12 years, but I'm, this guy was one of your early clients. Yeah, I remember you. Yeah. He's like, yeah, I wanted to go back and do some training now. And so he's doing online training now, and he's crushing it.
So would you say a kind of a piece of your success and your ability to get new online clients when you did that was the newsletter? Were you kind of cultivating that and communicating with them? Were you emailing twice a week, once a month? What was your kind of frequency? Do you know, or did you have any frequency?
Yeah, so I started off, years ago, probably 12. I think I started a newsletter 14 years ago now, which it wasn't really that sexy. And I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't monetize it for a whole year. I just thought, hey, if I give out like the super technical, like great, hard teaching stuff, people will love me. Mm-hmm. And I got lots of great feedback. And then once I realized, I probably need to make money from this thing, I started having, a few offers and did some online stuff, did a little bit of affiliate work.
Right.
And the first time I said something out, like people hated it. I got tons of hate mail. And I'm like, what? And what I realized was I kind of screwed up in that I did a little bit too much of the hard teaching stuff and never sold anything. So I had a whole list of, 20,000 people at that time who were just like tire kickers, who they were never going to do anything with the information, but they wanted the most technical stuff possible. And related to that, I also realized that the newsletter worked good to bump up the blog in terms of traffic in Google. So back in the day, if you put up a new site, Google would always be looking, and it's probably still true to this day. I would send out a newsletter and say, hey, I got this brand new article I put up on my site, go check it out. And within a couple of days, I get 1,000 people or so that would hit it, but it was all organic traffic because they're all from wherever. So Google would see that and they're like, oh wow, this must be something super important because it looks like it's all organic traffic. So I did that for quite a while. Doesn't really pull quite as much as it does now. And I was probably sending a newsletter twice a week. And then I would start sending it 3 times a week. And then when I hired the business guy, he's like, hey, you've got a newsletter. It looks like you've done writing. He's like, you should send something every day. And you should start having promotions. You should start selling stuff. And I'm like, send something every day? What are you, insane? Like, people are going to hate me. This is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Right. And he's like, no, trust me, this will work. I'm thinking, okay, why am I paying this guy almost $3,000 a month to like specifically not do what he's telling me? Like he's just not trying to tank my business. He's trying to help me. And for God's sake, I'm paying it a huge amount of money. So I said, okay, here's the deal. I will do this. I'll test it for 2 months. But if I get, just a huge amount of unsubscribers, I'm going to stop doing it. What I found was I didn't get any more unsubscribers. Like everything got better. Right. I was like, oh, wait a minute. I'm like, oh, you mean like if you communicate with people more often and you have something intelligent to say that you're adding to their life in an infotainment sort of way, like people are very tolerant of it and actually like it. Mm-hmm. But it's a weird thing even now in fitness. Like if you ask someone to say, hey, do you want to be on another newsletter? They're like, what? Hell no. That's like I don't want to be on any damn newsletters because they assume most newsletters suck, which is probably true. Right. That was 8 years ago. I probably started sending 6 days a week is about still what I send right now. So almost daily.
How are you getting people on your list? Did you have an opt-in? Did you have a lead magnet? Were you giving something away?
Yeah, I did opt-ins through the website. I've gone through various versions of that. And that was the main way. I did some, when I worked with the business guy, we did some paid traffic for a while that he ran all that stuff. And the other part too, for people listening is I've tried everything. Like I did a lot of speaking for quite a while. not as much the past couple of years, especially since COVID. I mean, I tried text in this number, here's, the URL. And I'm sure there's a lot of things that can work. But I realized after all my testing, the thing that worked the best was just literally old school. Hey, I'm going to pass around a notebook, and I would put what the free offer was at the top, and I would number them all the way down the side. So if there's 100 people there, I would put 110 slots. And above each page, I'd put a name and an email already filled in. And what you figure out is it's like monkey see, monkey do. The first person, if they start putting their email and stuff down, almost everyone else will fill it out after it. But if the first couple of people look at it and going, then almost nobody fills it out. And so I would take that, I would scan it, and I have a virtual assistant that would, type everything up for me. And then I would just enter that into the newsletter service. And it'd be simple, hey, here's a copy of all my slides, or here's a free offer.
Right.
And then my wife, Jody, would pass that around. And even to this day, that still pulls way better than anything else I've ever done.
The way you explained it makes a lot of sense, though, right? The kind of monkey see, monkey do.
Yeah.
Because it's it's almost like social proof.
Yeah, it is.
So-and-so trainer, I may not know them, but, they wanted this. Oh, I should probably get this as well. Versus the text, you put the text, 555-333, to this number, and we'll send it to you. That's all very individual, and you don't know if anyone else is doing it.
Yes.
It'd actually be interesting if someone did that and you had a little graph where it was showing the number of people opting in to create that social. But I think you're right. I think it's that social. And then once you get towards the back and you see a bunch of names on there, you're like, oh, this has to be valuable. These 15, 20 people already opted in. That's a great idea. I'm definitely going to steal that. So thank you.
Yeah. And the thing I got a little better at, what I realized exactly that is if let's say there's a seminar of 100 and I could test it, right? So I'd say, okay, how many people showed up to my talk? 110. How many emails did I get? 100, right? So I could look at potential people versus how many people actually put their name down.
Right.
And what I realized was exactly what you said. If the first couple of people do, then you're good. So a lot of times, before Jody would help me with this, my wife, I would just literally stop in the middle of the thing. I'd hold up the pen and paper and I'd walk over and I would literally kind of stand there and watch the first kind of creepily watch the first couple of people, make sure they fill their name out.
Yeah. You could almost plant a couple people, you have a couple of your friends be the first two that do it just to get the ball rolling a little bit.
And that's why literally on the top of every page, I would put a name and an email. They're obviously not real names or real emails, because if you flip the page over and that first slot was blank, a lot of people would look and go, and they'd start passing it, and then no one would fill it out, and then you're hosed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it goes both ways, right? If people start filling it out early, you're probably going to get a lot. And if people don't fill it out early, then it's going to be kind of a flop. And so that's a super awesome little tidbit. And so you're doing that to build the email lists, and then you had the opt-in on the site. Was there anything else that you were doing that was, because 20,000 people is not a small list. That's a nice size list, especially for a personal brand.
In hindsight, I would have been way more hyper aggressive with that. Because I think 8 years ago, and you can probably attest to this too, it was pretty easy to get emails from people.
Yeah.
If you look at, how John Berardi started Precision Nutrition, they started doing a newsletter list super early on. Right. And, obviously their newsletter list now when they sold it was huge. But it was easy to get people's names. People I want information. This is new, unique. Spam wasn't as big of a deal.
Right.
Where now to get an email address from someone it's not very easy. Your cost of acquisition, if you're doing paid traffic, all that stuff is quite a bit more expensive. On one hand, we have Facebook and Instagram and better targeting tools. But at the same point, I think people are much more reluctant to give that up compared to what they used to before.
As a gym owner, Coach Catalyst is the key to having low turnover. For several years, I struggled and spent 10 to 20 hours a week communicating with clients via phone calls, Facebook Messenger, email, and text messages. I had tried everything to make my life more efficient. I was at my wit's end. And then I found Coach Catalyst. Since starting the software, I have found a life again, and my clients are thanking me for being so involved in their fitness life. I've cut my daily commitment to interacting with over 300 clients to under 15 minutes a day and have streamlined my 6-week challenges. I couldn't recommend it more. I just don't know if I would even be here today if it wasn't for Coach Catalyst. If you don't have an account already, you're missing out and not helping the people you could be.
Yeah, I would. So, I mean, if you were to go back, let's say you're starting again from scratch now, do you think newsletter is still a core marketing strategy for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased because that's what 90% of my business is, and I teach that in like the Flex Diet mentorship and stuff. What I like about it is that because of my engineering background, I realized real soon, like you probably remember this, God, is it 6 years ago now, where Facebook changed their algorithm from when you had your own personal brand, your reach was pretty good. And then Facebook said, screw it, we're just going to crush everybody's reach on your personal brand. But on a business page, you can have a greater reach. But now, because we're a public company, you're going to have to pay a lot of money to do this.
Right.
And when I saw that, I was like, oh shit, like you're really on a rented audience, because like my reach on Facebook at that point just like nosedive to like nothing. And you realize that they can make any algorithm change they want at any point, and you're just renting an audience from people. And so that kind of reaffirmed that if I have their email address, I control what content I send them. I control when I send it. I also control if I screw up and a bunch of people unsubscribe, that's totally on me too. That's not distribution at all. And so I wanted to control the distribution of it. And that if Facebook implodes, we could all be like, hey, screw Facebook, we're all on Instagram. I could send one email and be like, we're all on Instagram, or God forbid TikTok or YouTube or whatever. Like I could send people wherever I wanted the people to go to. And it was something that I controlled, which I liked, especially if it's your own business. Because and fast forward also, years ago, there used to be something done for websites called article spinning, where people would take one article and then they would hire these people, usually in virtual assistants, wherever, and they would write like 20 versions of that article. They'd only put one of those articles like public facing, but in the back on the index of the site, they'd have like these 20 different versions. So Google would index their site and they'd look at these different versions. They'd just lay them on top of each other and be like, oh, wow, these are all about the same, fat loss thing with cold thermogenesis or whatever. Oh, but the articles aren't really identical. So, wow, this guy must be an expert on this topic.
Right.
So we're going to send them a whole bunch of traffic. And that worked. Like I knew guys who did, 6-figure businesses just off of that easy. But then Google got smart and said, hey, wait a minute. These people are trying to game the system. So they did, I don't know, whatever animal update it was, Penguin or whatever. Right. And they just crushed those people's sites. Like they just basically blacklisted them. And so I knew people who were just getting a ton of traffic from that, went to almost zero traffic overnight. And luckily, a couple of them had a newsletter, so they survived. But the handful of people who didn't have a newsletter, like the couple of people I knew, they were just out of business overnight. And so then I realized I'm like, oh, like, trusting other companies, whether you can argue if that's, the ethical thing to do with article spinning and everything else, you don't control any of that. And that just made me more nervous and realize that I just want to do things that I control because it makes me sleep better at night.
And I mean, email from a marketing standpoint is kind of one of the things that you have the most control over. ConvertKit or MailChimp could go down, but you can, even exported lists and you can take them somewhere else. And so how do you come up? So you said you're writing content probably about 6 days a week. How do you come up with that much content? Is it just like a vlog almost? Like you're just kind of chronicling like daily stuff? Or do you have a certain like framework or system that you use to come up with 6 days a week of content?
I've done both. I've been super systematic with stuff and written, stuff like a couple of weeks ahead of time. That for me was a lot harder. So if I'm doing a promotion for like the Flex Diet Cert or the Phys Flex Cert, those I generally will do ahead of time, and I spend a fair amount of time writing them in sequence because they all have to flow one to the next because they're all leading back to this product. Where when I did those as one-off, they were very disconjointed. It was very confusing. Nobody knew what the hell was going on. So those I tend to write all at once to make sure that the story is consistent. most day-to-day stuff, I literally just get up at some point and I'm like, okay, I have to have a newsletter that goes out. It has to be useful. So the one reason I do 6 days a week, not 7, some days you're just stuck and you don't have anything. It's like, I'm not going to send a newsletter just to say that I sent a newsletter if it's shit. Yeah. Nobody wants to read that. But if you have a deadline, it's amazing how ideas just show up. I've got a thing in, what do I use? Evernote. That just says newsletter ideas and topics. So I'll write something on that. If I have something I'm sort of promoting, like now I'm doing a grip course with Adam Glass we're promoting. So even last night, like it was super busy. I decided to go kiteboard in the rain during the day. I got back in and I still had no idea what I was going to write about for a newsletter. And so I just went for a walk, thought about it, and I was like, oh, okay. It's like wrote one about, if you're waiting for optimal or perfect conditions, it's not going to happen. And if I can tie it back into something lifestyle I'm related to, I went kiteboarding in the rain with a bunch of other kooks, right? Then it's a little bit more infotainment and it makes you also sound like a real human being.
Right.
I'm on newsletter lists from some people I think are really good researchers, but I won't say any names, but I think their newsletters are boring as hell and I don't even want to read them. Right. And I like that stuff. Right. So I think it's kind of finding your niche. And, the book Range, David Epstein is really good. His whole premise is if you can just take 2 areas and kind of overlap them and be like the person in both those areas, you can probably be pretty damn good, right? You maybe only need to be 80% in both areas, but in that overlap, like you can do really well. So I would say, I get lots of very nice people say nice things about my newsletter and stuff. But when I read other people I would consider that are like legit writers, I'm like, oh my God, I read like a 5th grader, but I can write stuff in a semi-infotainment way that is translation of some pretty hardcore research. So now I have the hardcore research area and the writing kind of overlap, and you can do pretty well in those areas. So I think for people listening, they probably know enough fitness information that they could talk about it. You could take, what you talk about to your clients every day, and then just try to make it somewhat interesting. Like try to talk like a real human, and the more kind of personal stuff I put into the newsletter, as long as it fits with what I'm saying, it makes you more unique. And I think that's a benefit. And everybody has their own, weird quirks and all that kind of stuff. Like everybody on my list knows I love black coffee, dark beer, and death metal, and I kiteboard for fun. Right. I don't expect anyone to enjoy those things per se, but the internet is so big that even now, like my one-on-one clients, like probably half of them listen to like death metal.
Right. Well, it creates some personality too, right? Like humans want to connect with humans. And so when they know what someone likes and what their personality is like and their quirks and their writing style and all of that, you just feel more connected. And then you're more likely to trust that person too. Like, oh, hey.
Oh, 100%.
Mike's recommending this thing. Okay, cool. I'm going to definitely check it out because he doesn't just recommend everything. Like he does his due diligence and he only brings things that might provide some value to my life. And so, yes, I think that's super awesome. And so, I mean, you've continued to build that list now and you've kind of forayed that into, you do the online coaching thing where I think you only take like a select amount of clients, right? You feel like there's a number that you can serve like appropriately. What do you mind sharing that number?
Yeah,
on what you feel like is?
I don't know how people do online coaching with like 40 to 50 clients. I just absolutely boggles my mind. I got up to 26 clients at one point after COVID hit. Because when COVID hit, I was like, oh my God, I'm so worried. Like, I'm so screwed. Like, 80% of my clients are trainers also. Like, a lot of them can't even go to the gym. They don't have income. And so there was a big demand for online people. So I just said yes to everyone. I was like, great, dude, you want to come in? Great. Because my expectation was they're all just going to go off a cliff and I'm going to lose like 50% of the people overnight. Well, it actually didn't happen. Like, everybody stayed. So I had a period of about a year where I had 25 clients. And I realized I can do this, but man, this is like my limit. Because I like doing other stuff in addition to it. So I kind of let those dwindle down on purpose. And so technically I haven't opened it up to the public for a year and a half. And right now I only have 13. and I've kind of capped it at 12 to 13, just because of all the other stuff I have going on.
Right.
So but I also do all their training, all their mobility. We're looking at heart rate variability, potentially some blood work, whatever else. And it's not something where I can just write a program for 12 weeks and they just do a check-in and say, yeah, I'm good. Right. There's always something going on that needs to be adjusted, which I like. Right. I mean, that's why I think people pay more money for that too. Right. So there's definitely, I think, a limit, and it's different for each person. Right. And I think being super clear up front with what you're going to do with clients and what are your boundaries is something I probably should have done a lot sooner. Because for a while, 8 years ago, it was like, hey, here's my private cell phone. Call me anytime. And then you get, client Bob, who's at Target, who's like sending you pictures of fish oil because he doesn't know which one is better. And you're like, oh my God, I hate my life. Why did I allow this in?
Yeah. What are some of the boundaries that you set now with clients, or what? You shouldn't even say boundaries, like expectations in working together?
It's getting better. So for me, I'm like, hey, you have your check-in on Sunday night. Just send a couple sentences of how, your week went. I don't need paragraphs. Write as much as you want or as little as you want. Don't care. Mm-hmm. And then on Monday, I'll go and pull all your data, whether it's Aura data, chronometer, HRV. And then by Tuesday at midnight, I'll get back to you. We'll see if we need to change your program. We need to change your nutrition. What are we doing for this week? Or maybe it's like everything's all good. Like your plan's set up, like you're on track. Cool. Just keep going with it. Mm-hmm. And then email, I get back to people 24 to 48 hours. I'm working on trying to take Sundays off now, but it's kind of hit or miss because the way the week goes, a lot of times I don't get around to updating their program or checking in until Sunday and seeing if there's any differences. Yeah. And honestly, like some clients, after a while, I'm like, hey, here's my cell phone. Like if you have anything that you feel is urgent, just text me. That could be like, hey, we put your stuff in TrueCoach and it's not there. Like, I don't know what to do at the gym today. Cool. I want to know about that so I can fix it, But it's interesting how so when I put that out, I tell them this is my private cell phone number. And I say that on purpose because one, it's true. And two, there's something about people feel bad interrupting you, where I think a mistake I made early on was assuming that I'll just do everything by email, and they would email something that was semi-urgent and then they wouldn't hear back and then they were mad. Mm-hmm. Or now it's like if they really need something, they can get a hold of me. But there's also that other barrier where they kind of know, I should probably make sure this is like a legitimate thing or not.
Right.
And then I don't have any clients that do this now, but I'd say in the past, I learned very quickly that the faster I got back to people, the worse it was, which doesn't make any sense initially, right? Because for a while I was like, I'm online all day. This is all I'm doing. Like, I'm going to be in my email. Like, this is a question. I'm going to get back to them within a couple hours. Mm-hmm. And all I got was just really bad questions. And so I was spending all day just emailing people. It would start off as, hey, what's a cue for this squat? And it would end up being, I took an extra 0.5 gram of fish oil today. Am I going to die? Right? It would end up into something completely different that was unrelated to what was going on. And so now I tell people like, hey, I generally check my email once or twice a day. When you send a note, I'll get back to you within 24 to 48 hours. And so if they happen to send like 4 emails in a row, on purpose, I will answer all 4 emails at once. Like I will not send a response back. And if they are online a lot and they do send a response back right away, if it's something related that's urgent, that they need the information that would change what they're going to do tomorrow, I might answer it. I'll honestly, my clients are probably listening to this now, but whatever. If it's not super urgent, I'll actually delay it. And I will not get back to them again until the next day, because I want them to think a little bit through some of their own problems, because eventually I'm not going to be there. Right. And two, if I got back to them now or tomorrow, it wouldn't change the action that they're going to do. Right. So I don't like the expectation of being hyper responsive all the time, because at some point they have enough information to act. Now you need to go do the action. And when the action is different, cool, we'll give you more information. Like, I'll help you as much as you need, but I'm also not going to facilitate your asking questions to substitute for action. Because it feels like the client's making progress, right? They feel like, I just need more information, and this next thing, that's going to be the key. It's like, no, go lift. Let me know how your session went. and we'll change something if needed. Cool. I have no problem changing stuff. I've rewritten programs like at the drop of a hat. That's cool. But that's based on what your outcome was from doing the action, not just what you thought in your head was going to happen.
Which, I mean, it's so true, because we see coaches with this a lot, especially early on. You want to please, and you feel like, hey, if I drop the ball at all, the client's going to quit, and I'm going to lose my business, yada yada. Like, you just go down that rabbit hole. And so, but what you do when you're hyper responsive is that you're setting the expectation, and that's an unrealistic expectation to uphold over the long term, and there's no buffer, there's no slack in the system. And so the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to disappoint someone, because they're expecting you to respond, because you set that expectation. And now, because someone's sick, you got to go, like, you just can't do it. And now people are upset because of that. So I mean, I think the more you can be cognizant about that, but it's hard when you're a brand new coach. It's really hard, because you really want to please. You want to provide the best experience possible for your clients. And then the other thing that comes into play is what happens when you have 10 clients? What happens when you have 20 clients? Like, now you don't have every moment to respond to that client. And sometimes we have to think about that scale right from the beginning.
Another quick thing I'd add too is something I do now is I correct people's language immediately. Where in the past I was like super afraid. I'm like, I don't know, they're not really bought in. I'm going to wait a couple months. Where now somebody says like, oh man, I shouldn't have eaten the birthday cake or whatever. It's like, hey man, you decided to eat the birthday cake. Cool. Hopefully you enjoyed the birthday cake. Right. Now we're going to get back on track, and I want you to have more protein at your next meal, or whatever it is. Right. Or even just pointing out to them, you realize you said, this. I'm just pointing it out to you so that which I think is helpful. And one of the reasons they're hiring a coach anyway, for mindset, mental stuff, not to diagnose. But in the past, I was super afraid that, I'm going to make them mad. I'm going to upset them. And now I'm just like, hey, sometimes it's like, hey, here's your tough love. And at some point, if they fire you, it wasn't a good fit. But, that's okay. I'd rather find out sooner than later, because the reality is they hired me to do the best job I can to help them. So if I'm not doing things to help them, then I'm actually hurting them, even though it makes me sometimes, especially when I did that initially, kind of nervous that people are going to be mad at you about it.
Right. Yeah. Totally agree. I think that's awesome. And so, I mean, you're a very cerebral dude. Do you think that's why you kind of moved into now creating the Flex Diet certification, and kind of moving in? What's the other one called? MetFlex or
physiologic flexibility?
Physiological flexibility. So tell me a little bit first about Flex Diet. I mean, where did that come from? What hole did you see in the market? What did you want to help coaches with?
So I always like the education aspect. So I still do this. I still teach, and then wonder, why am I teaching all this, stuff to some students who may or may not be interested in? And now when I teach, I only teach to people I think that are going to be interested. And what I realized was, like, I remember again having a meeting with Ryan Lee, probably 4 years ago now. I had just launched this whole product to my list, and it was an ongoing revenue thing. I thought it was going to be perfect for trainers. I had like pre-written programs, nutrition tips, and all this stuff. And over the course of 6 months, I sold 3. Like 3, literally. It was a disaster. It was horrible. I bled money like crazy. And so I remember going to this 2-day mastermind with Ryan Lee, telling him all this stuff. And he's like, why don't you just do a certification? I'm like, certification? Like, I don't want to be one of those douchebags out there selling certifications. It's not based on anything, because it's not accredited and everything else. And he's like, well, but you're the douchebag who actually has the background and credentials to actually do it correctly. And you're not going to release something that's just shit anyway, are you? Right. I was like, oh yeah. And he's like, trainers will buy certifications. Like, trying to continue to sell continuing education stuff, it can be done. It's just a lot more difficult. I was like, oh. And so he gave me the name Flex Diet, actually.
Okay. And Ryan's a smart dude. Like, he's the OG.
It's amazing how often you just tell him like this, and he's like, yep, this. And I was like, yep. Damn it. What? Even when I did the podcast, I spent all this time and effort thinking of a name. And he puts on a Facebook comment once. He's like, bro, why is your podcast called a different name and not Flex Diet Podcast? I was like, oh, shit. So obvious.
Right.
And then I like the idea of a certification because it's leverage, right? I can create it once, come up with a system. And the thing I found was, especially teaching a lot more, I would go to a lot of gyms, especially CrossFit gyms, and I'd ask them, I was like, hey, who's doing your certification? They're like, what do you do for nutrition? Like, we don't do anything with nutrition. We do like 30-day challenges. I'm like, oh, so 1 month it's keto and 1 month it's Whole30 and 1 month carbs are bad, no carbs are good. And I'm like, how does that work for you? They're like, I don't know. People just seem really confused and never follow through. I'm like, go figure.
Right.
So I'm like, well, I'll just do a system that one person in your gym can run all of it. So if you have 150 people in your gym, one person can manage it and it's still semi-custom. So here's your starting point. But within your starting point, it's kind of like the bumper bowling, right? So if you ever go bowling where they inflate those little bumpers on the side, it's like the standard way of coaching nutrition is your clients come in and like you tell them, hey, here's your meal plan or here's your thing. You're literally expecting them to bowl strikes like out of the gate, which is not going to happen. Like you need some variability. But if you put little bumpers in the lane, like just keep them in one lane and let them just start knocking some pins down. Like you don't want them in like 4 lanes down doing, keto because Crazy Carl said keto is the best thing ever, right? It's like, no, just go one direction. Let's work on protein, micronutrition, NEAT, whatever. And so that's the system that I set up where you know where to start, but clients are allowed to vary a little bit and all have different action items within that one area. And so I was trying to solve the issue of one person in your gym can be literally in charge of like 150 people, right? We use obviously your software to run all that, and they can get a semi-customized approach. And the gym owners are not pulling their hair out trying to do individual stuff for every single person. Where most like general client stuff and even elite athletes, like their nutrition is pretty horrible.
Yeah.
Like you don't need anything that crazy. You need more of a systematic and systems approach to have something that's solid, so that it's consistent for like literally like the next year, and people do way better with that.
And I mean, we've talked about this in depth in some of our summits and more things. And if people wanted to find out, is it just flexdiet.com? Is that
flexdiet.com.
And then you went into the physiologic flexibility?
Physiologic flexibility.
So was that just kind of like, cold thermogenesis, ice baths, saunas, like all this stuff was like becoming the rage and is the rage. And it's like, I need to bring some sense to the industry a little bit rather than just like, just go 10 minutes in an ice tub and then 20 minutes in an infrared and you're going to be good.
Yeah. So back to the seminar I did with Ryan Lee. So he gives me the idea for Flex Diet. I was like, oh, perfect. Like I got everything already down for this. I gave myself 4 months to figure out the system, whatever. And I remember in the meeting, I was saying, I said, hey, I got that, the next day, come back. I said, I got that all kind of laid out. I know what to do. And I said, I got an idea for level 2 on physiologic flexibility. This was 4 years ago. And he looks at me and he goes, don't release a level 2 for at least 1 to 2 years. Like pick one thing, do that, and then you can do something else. I was like, oh, yeah, good point. So 13 years ago, I started working on metabolic flexibility, which is the basis for the Flex Diet. A couple of years after that, I was like, okay, so how do we apply those concepts to you, not just nutrition, but you as a human organism? Like once you're down with basic exercise and basic nutrition and your sleep's not a trash bin fire, what's the next level? Like, how do you know more advanced things? And do you have a system of how to figure them out? Because every, biohacker Bob or whatever tells you to, shove the infrared probe up your ass or whatever you're supposed to do, right? And then there's a never ending thing you could do. Now cold is sexy, hot. But there was no system of anyone put any thought into, well, how do these things make you a better, organism?
Right.
So I looked at it and I said, okay, well, what in physiology do we have to hold steady? And it's, what do you call homeostatic regulators? So temperature, right? You have to keep 98.6 degrees. pH, your blood has to stay in a very, very tight range of pH. Blood glucose, oxygen and carbon dioxide. All those things, those are your 4 main homeostatic regulators. They all have to be held really, really constant or a world of hurt's going to happen to you. But we know within each one of those, you can train in the ability to be more adaptable. when you get doing cold water immersion, you get better at being in cold water. We know heat acclimation. We know do some heinous, high intensity interval training. It's going to change your pH, but your body gets better at buffering those changes in pH. So I took those 4 homeostatic regulators, and then each one has, both ends. So you end up again with the same format as the Flex Diet Cert. You have 8 interventions. You have a big picture that says, okay, here's how all these advanced recovery things are related. Here's the physiology of each one, right? Because a lot of stuff about cold water immersion is just complete BS. But it's useful. I've been doing it for like 3 years now. I think it's great. And then here's your 5 action items for each one. So you know the big picture, you understand the physiology, and you know what action items you should give a client at a particular point. Because right now it's just like haphazard. Like, bro, you want to like maximize hypertrophy, like do cold water immersion. Well, maybe not the best idea. But then everyone else is like, no, never do it. Like, well, that's not the best idea either. Right. So put it in a framework that people can then apply it and make sure that it's a systematic thing. And not just, Joe Rogan stayed in for 20 minutes at 37 degrees. So that's what I'm going to do. Or David Goggins says I'm supposed to go run, 800 miles with a Lego in my shoe to make it harder. It's like, those things can be useful, but like, you probably don't want to start there.
I love it. That's great. I want to be respectful of your time, and you got to run here in a little bit. What's next? What are you working on now? What's next for you? I know you got some grip stuff. You seem to be obsessed with grip right now. Yeah, just from basically what I follow.
Yeah, so the grip stuff started, probably 13 years ago. Again, similar to strength training stuff, is like, oh my God, my grip is horrible. Not just bad, like horrible. And like, I had been training for a while. How does this happen? And it so happened that my buddy Adam Glass was in the Twin Cities for a while, and, world-renowned strongman competitor for grip strength. And I just started training it because I wanted to get better. And it so happened that one of the top coaches actually, not only is he really good at grip stuff, like amazingly good, he can actually teach and he can actually coach it. So just started doing some grip competitions with him in the Twin Cities. My wife and I ended up actually competing in a grip competition in Finland in 2019, right before COVID. I got dead last or something. I competed against, Adam and Tanner and all these like top people literally in the world. But I'm like, hey, who else gets to compete in Finland? So of course I'm going to go. And what I realized with training more clients was a lot of times it's just a rate limiter on their strength. Okay. Like I've never met a really strong person who had a horrible grip. Okay. And it's a two-way street. If you train your grip to get stronger, which doesn't take a whole lot of time, you can actually get physically stronger too. So one of my main goals, which has been for the last 5 years, is to do a one-hand deadlift with a Thomas inch dumbbell. So 175-pound cast dumbbell with a 2 3/8 inch handle. It's like the handle the size of a pop can. What you realize real soon is a 175-pound one-hand deadlift, not really that heavy, but the handle thickness and the fact that it doesn't rotate makes it pretty damn hard, because it just wants to spin right out of your hand. And what you realize soon is if you can't hold on to it, like you can't move it at all. So we have a grip product. You just go to gonzogripstrength.com. So that's with Adam Glass. And then, other stuff working on the kiteboarding stuff we talked about. That's probably my main thing. Working on Triphasic 2 with Coach Catalyst, who I've known for coming up on probably 15 years now. Yep. So trying to get that done, hopefully in the next few months. That's been ever ongoing for about 7 years now, but we will get it done at some point. And then the certifications, and still doing work for the Carrick Institute, do some products for them. I teach online for Walsh University. And then I also just started helping out the guys at Rapid Health. So Dr. Andy Gelpin, Dan Garner, Doug Anders, those guys from Barbell Shrugged. So helping them out on the back end with some of the different evals for some of their clients too.
Cool. Busy man, right? That's awesome.
Yeah, a couple things going on.
Right. I love it. Do you feel like, just quick on this one, do you feel like your kiteboarding has improved as your grip strength improves? Do you feel like your kiteboarding improves as well? Or is kiteboarding not quite as grip intensive?
I would say yes. It's just never, for me, it's like never a limiter. And it's kind of funny. Like normally, like if I'm out riding, like I'm usually in the top, 1 to 5 for like distance road. Like I'll go out and ride like 40 miles in one session and ride for like 3 hours. it doesn't feel like it's that difficult to me from a lower body strength and a grip perspective. But to everyone else, they're like, that's crazy. What are you doing? I'm like,
right.
I don't know. That part's not hard. Like for me, like jumping higher because of some of the eye stuff is way more difficult.
Okay. Right.
But I've done more like clinical functional neurology with that over the past few years with Dr. Schmo, who's in the Twin Cities, and other Carrig people. So that's probably made the biggest difference overall, where now when I'm doing a jump, most days I can kind of see where I'm at and I have a good idea of kind of when I'm going to land. Cool. So that's probably the thing that's made the biggest difference overall.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Last rapid fire question. If you could live in any cartoon world for a week, what cartoon world do you live in?
Cartoon world. Ooh. I would say for a week, I would actually pick the Jetsons. I don't know why.
Ooh, nice one.
But I just think flying around in your own little like bubble cars and just seeing what the future looks like. I think that'd be pretty cool.
I love it. I love it. I think that's a great way to end this one. So if people want to find out a little bit more about you, what are some good places?
The main place where everything goes through is the main website, which is miketnelson.com. And you'll be able to find out more information about all the certifications, everything else. Flex Diet Cert is just at flexdiet.com. And then I do have some random stuff on Instagram, which is just Dr. Mike T. Nelson. So DrMiketNelson. Most of the content still goes out through the newsletter, like we talked about.
Yep.
So you can sign up to the newsletter, miketnelson.com, and just say hi. Tell me that you heard me on the show with Trevor here, and we'll send you a cool free gift too.
I love it. And we'll have all of that in the show notes too. So definitely check that out. Mike, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I always appreciate talking to you. And thank you so much for your help with the software for the Flex Diet Cert too. That makes it much more usable for people. And once they pass the cert, they get all the action items and everything. They can all just be preloaded right into it. So they're all good to go.
That's right. It's auto magic. I love it, man.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of the Coach Catalyst podcast. If you are a coach looking to do more for your clients than just workouts, give Coach Catalyst a test drive. Try it for 14 days. Jump on call with your personal strategy coach, Ashley, and see how easy technology can be, all for free. Tell them Trevor sent you. Until next time, keep changing lives.